There's been a battle really over 200-300 years in the world between what the policies of the British East India Company, which, as I said, formed the basis for the British Empire. It's free trade versus protectionism. And of course, President Trump is well known as what was Alexander Hamilton, McKinley, Lincoln, for advocating protective tariffs in order to develop the manufacturing capability of the United States. So there's a receptivity to the American system all over the world. And for good reason, the British try to keep knowledge of that American system out of the schools and out of discussion. But also, one of the other things which distinguishes the American from the British system, which I neglected at the beginning, is independent central banking versus national banking.
Hello and welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty with Scott Tregurtha, where we help critical thinkers by giving you the most true and accurate information we can find, which they should be giving you on mainstream media, but are not. So you can decide for yourself and take control of your liberty, your freedom, and your future. And now, here is Scott Tregurtha.
Hello, everybody. Since a very high percentage of America started waking up, I'd say mostly around the advent of the Trump administration in 2016 and throughout that administration, and continuing to wake up more and more during the Russia hoax, the Trump impeachments, the Soviet-style prosecutions of Donald Trump, Roger Stone, General Michael Flynn, etc., etc., and the prosecutions and jailing of January 6 protesters, as well as Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon, and throughout COVID, the COVID hoax, and the experience of the Biden-Harris administration, and on and on. The word oligarchs has become very common, as well as the terms deep state, military-industrial complex, etc. But who are these oligarchs? The answer is really simple and staring us right in the face. And my next guest is not only going to tell us who it is, but is also going to give us some history and facts to back it all up. I am very excited to present to you political activist and author, Mr. Will Wertz.
So, hi, Will. Welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty. Hi, Scott. Glad to be here. Glad you came. So, what we want to do today, I believe from what we spoke before, you wrote a book, and the main purpose of the book is to impart history, knowledge, and scientific principles necessary to release the world from the Anglo-Dutch system and to realize a future based on true nature of man. Does that sound about right?
That's it.
Okay. And of course, the name of the book is Beware the British East India Company. So I was wondering, could we start out with what I want to do ultimately by the end of this is link the formation of this oligarchy or empire, link it to what's going on today, and kind of get some tangible facts out there so people can actually relate to it. Because, as you know, if you say British Empire these days, it's getting more common, but people don't necessarily put that together with what's going on every day. And there are things that are happening every day on the news and everything that link the British to this. So can you start off with a little history and bring us kind of up to modern day?
Well, the British Empire emerged from the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, both of which were formed in the early 1600s. Throughout their history, they actually were engaged in a number of wars against each other for control of Asia in particular. But eventually they merged, particularly during the so-called Glorious Revolution, when William of Orange, who was Dutch, took over the throne of Great Britain with his English wife, Mary. That was in 1688. Shortly thereafter, the Bank of England was formed in the early 1690s. And then later, you had the consolidation of the British East India Company as the basis for the British Empire after the 7 Years' War. This was in the mid-1700s, and the Treaty of Paris concluded that war, which we refer to as the French and Indian Wars in the United States, in 1763. At that point, the British Empire was consolidated, but it operated as it did earlier through the British East India Company, which was a pirate organization. Historically, they were involved in the conquering of India, which was viewed as the crown jewel of the British Empire. They waged 2 opium wars against China in the early 1800s, before the American Civil War. The British East India Company and another company created in the 1500s called the Muscovy, or the Russian Company, were also involved in operations against Russia, which resulted in the 1800s in the assassination of Tsar Paul I by a palace guard that was working with British foreign intelligence. And the reason he was assassinated is because Tsar Paul I, as was the case with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, were committed to liberating India, returning its sovereignty, liberating it from the British East India Company. So there's been a battle really over 200-300 years in the world between what the policies of the British East India Company, which, as I said, formed the basis for the British Empire, and what emerged with the American Revolution, which is the American system of political economy, of Alexander Hamilton, of Friedrich, Henry C. Carey, who was an advisor to Lincoln, McKinley, and later Franklin Roosevelt. And this is the battle which is going on today in the world. Many people don't understand it, but this is the fundamental conflict in the world today, and it's urgent that the American system prevail over the British Empire, and that the United States, in order to do that, breaks from a special relationship with the British.
Got it. Okay. So the British Empire started out as pirates, and they still are.
Yeah,
right? And they are intermingled with they're actually not just intermingled, they are part of everything that's going on in the world, economically, wars, the whole 9 yards. So it's probably a good time to define, before we get into this further, the American system of economy and the British system of economy. Can you do that? And then so people know, the American system's what we've been trying to have all these years, and the British system is what they've been never given up on imposing on us. So,
yeah, well, Henry C. Carey, the advisor to Abraham Lincoln, wrote a book called Harmony of Interest, and he summarized the difference very clearly. What he stressed is that the American system is a system of fair and reciprocal trade, utilizing protective tariffs, whereas the British system is a system which is based upon free trade. This is what Adam Smith, for instance, wrote in his Wealth of Nations. The basic idea in respect to the U.S. colonies at the time of the American Revolution was to keep the United States as a raw materials exporter. Manufacturing was outlawed in the colonies. And the basic idea was free trade was an ideology used to allow Britain to dump its manufactured goods freely on the U.S. colonies, which made it impossible for the colonies to develop their own manufacturing because the British could do it at a lower cost than it would cost to develop manufacturing from scratch. So this is one of the differences: free trade versus protectionism. And of course, President Trump is well known as what was Alexander Hamilton, McKinley, Lincoln, for advocating protected tariffs in order to develop the manufacturing capability of the United States. Secondly, the British system has always been based upon Malthusianism. Thomas Malthus was the first professor of political economy at the British East India Company College in England. This is at the beginning of the 1800s. And he's the one who advocated the policies which today give us green ideology, which give us a policy of population reduction, and so forth. The American system has always been based upon the idea that there are no limits to growth, that we can redefine our resource base through the development of new higher order technologies like fission power or eventually fusion power, and that there is no limit to the capacity of the earth to produce sufficient food for a growing population, contrary to what Malthus argued. The British system is also a system which is involved in the spreading of drugs. We saw this with the 2 opium wars against China in the 1800s, before the American Civil War, and it actually began much earlier. They grew opium in India and exported it to China, forced the Chinese to accept the addiction of their population, and in order to pay for the purchase of tea, which was only produced in China at that time. Now, so here we had the British are, in a certain sense, the original drug cartels. So this has a real meaning today as well. Whereas in the American system, the emphasis is upon the development of the productive powers of the human mind. So you don't engage in the dissemination of drugs, which destroy the cognitive capacity of a human being. One American system economist by the name of Friedrich actually said that the basis for the American system economy is investment in what he called the capital of the mind. We had to invest in increasing the creative capabilities of the entire population in order to generate new wealth for future generations. On the other hand, it is well known that the British system is a system of universal war, what is talked about today in terms of endless war or perpetual warfare, because they need warfare in order to maintain their imperial system. Whereas the American system of political economy, which respects national sovereignty, is the basis for a universal peace. So those, in a certain sense, are the fundamental distinctions between the two systems that are facing the world today. And this is not taught in American universities. It's not known by even some of our adversaries, even though many of our adversaries, including Russia, China, and India, have been very receptive throughout their history to American system principles of political economy. For instance, Friedrich List's book, The National System of Political Economy, was translated into Chinese in the 1920s. It was circulated widely in India, which was looking for an alternative to the subjugation to the British Empire, and also in Russia. At the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, Friedrich List's works were publicized in Russia. So there's a receptivity to the American system all over the world. And for good reason, the British try to keep knowledge of that American system out of the schools and out of discussion.
Gotcha. So one is for the American system is for fair trade, and the British system is for free trade, basically, right? Now, can you help define it a little further? I know you've kind of covered it, but as you know, I think virtually most Americans think free trade is what we're all about. The term free trade. I mean, you hear it on anybody being interviewed on the conservative news stations, you name it. They're all pushing free trade, right? And if you say there's something wrong with free trade, well, the only alternative then it's either free trade or communism, right? So that's just not true. So can you really define what free trade is versus fair trade, which is what the American system is supposed to be doing?
Free trade is what deindustrialized the United States from the 1970s until today. This was a policy of globalization. It was a policy of, for instance, NAFTA, the agreement between U.S., Mexico, and Canada, which President Trump renegotiated during his first term to eliminate the worst aspects of this free trade policy. This was also the core of the Pacific free trade policy, which they tried to push through, and which President Trump opposed. The basic idea here is that under free trade, most of the manufacturing jobs in the United States were outsourced to China, Mexico, Southeast Asia, and other locations where they could take advantage of cheap labor and then send back goods to the United States at a lower cost than it would cost to produce them, providing a decent standard of living for American workers. So this is what free trade is. The system of, and this is a system that was advocated by the British under Adam Smith. Give you an example. Britain destroyed the industry of India and China in the 1600s. In the 1600s, India and China accounted for over 50% of the world GDP. And what the British did is they destroyed the shipbuilding industry, the textile industry, the steel industry in India, just as examples. They imposed massive tariffs on Indian exports and eliminated any kind of protection for Indian industry. And this was the intent of Adam Smith at the time of the founding of our nation. The basic idea was keep the United States colonies and eventually the United States as an agricultural country, which was engaged only in raw materials export. That's what they meant by free trade. It was, again, one of these situations where they used tariffs, but prevented other nations from using tariffs, saying that free trade was good. And the Dutch, for instance, they had a person under their employment called Hugo Grotius, who wrote Freedom of the Seas. And his whole idea was if any nation resisted free trade, that was a just cause for war against them. So this is what the Dutch East India Company did throughout Asia. They waged wars against any country which put up barriers to the free trade policies and freedom of the sea policies of the Dutch and of the British East India Company. So what President Trump is trying to do today is to reverse that free trade policy of the British Empire and of the Anglo-Dutch imperial system and impose protective tariffs, which will protect the workforce of the United States, create jobs, give us industry once again, so we can produce steel once again, so we can produce aluminum once again. These are industries, for instance, I lived in the Pacific Northwest for some time. And back there, because of the Bonneville Power Authority and the hydroelectric, energy was relatively inexpensive, so you had steel and aluminum in industry in Washington State. That's been eliminated. Similarly, we had steel and shipbuilding in Maryland. Once again, eliminated. And this is the policy that has to be turned around. So let me just bring it to an end right there.
Okay, I think I got it, and I think anyone who listened to this should be able to get it. If not, play it over. And of course, I always leave my contact information at the end. Please email me if you don't get it, because it's a concept we haven't really been taught. And I think it's a lot of it. I don't think, does Trump actually use the terminology free trade? Have you heard him use that as far as what he's trying to get rid of?
He called for free, fair, and reciprocal trade, which is a language that was also used by American system economists Friedrich and Henry C. Carey, as distinct from free trade and the free trade treaties that were foisted upon the United States. And it also should be noted that other countries have a right to engage in protectionism as well. And this is not destructive of collaboration through economic cooperation throughout the world. It just means that each country essentially has a policy of protecting its own manufacturing capability and its own workforce.
Gotcha. And that's what makes a nation strong and self-sufficient, sovereign, the whole 9 yards, right? So of course we're all for that, and we're all for the rest of the world adopting the American system. But that doesn't mean we are trying to shove it down anybody's throat. It just works well for everybody. And I believe the world powers or the world population that came here, this is what they were trying to establish, right? From the beginning, correct?
Yes. They were trying to get away from the oligarchy in Europe, which controlled everything. And so they came here and they developed a system which was qualitatively different than that which prevailed in Europe, particularly under the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. And remember, the Dutch actually controlled at one point all of what they called New Netherlands, which includes New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Connecticut, and on up into New England. And it was during these wars between the British and the Dutch that the British finally gained control. But that's why you have an Amsterdam Avenue in New York City.
Right. They used to call New York New Amsterdam, actually. Right?
Yeah. So this is a real issue in the world today. I would also, one of the other things which distinguishes the American from the British system, which I neglected at the beginning, is independent central banking versus national banking. The independent central bank emerged first in the Netherlands, where they had a Bank of Amsterdam, and then the Bank of England was created, as I mentioned earlier, in the early 1690s. This is the model for the Federal Reserve in the United States, and also for the European Central Bank. Whereas in the American system, we don't have independent central banking, which is controlled by a private banking cartel, out of the control of our sovereign nation. Rather, in the United States, beginning with Alexander Hamilton, we had the first national bank of the United States of America. We had a second national bank. That bank was not rechartered, thanks to a veto from Andrew Jackson. But Abraham Lincoln then had what he called the greenback policy, where the issuance of currency was under the control of the U.S. Treasury, as opposed to some central bank. But in 1913, we had the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And it's the Federal Reserve Bank which has been responsible since the 1970s for the destruction of the manufacturing capability of the United States. The Federal Reserve System under Paul Volcker, with his 20% interest rates, and his commitment to outsourcing and to the controlled disintegration of the U.S. industrial capacity. And then Alan Greenspan, with his advocacy of rescinding Glass-Steagall, which protected productive investment and penalized or left unprotected speculative investment. This policy of the Federal Reserve has been the destruction of our economy and of our national sovereignty. And whereas a national banking system is what you need in this country and in other countries throughout the world, if you're going to have sovereign control over nation states, and if you can create a new system based of a mutual respect among sovereign nation states, among a family of such sovereign nation states.
So I'm glad you brought that up. Can you go into more of, because it's all part of this, a national bank as opposed to a central bank, which is what our Federal Reserve is. And this should interest people who want to tear down the Fed. Most people do, but what do you replace it with? That's where the national bank comes in.
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve Bank provides no credit for real production. That's not in their mandate. They can print money to bail out bankrupt banks. They can manipulate interest rates so in order to allegedly achieve certain inflation rates or employment rates, but they do not extend credit for real production. And they are a bank of last resort to bail out a bankrupt system, as occurred in 2008, when we saw investment banks and even credit card companies turned into basically bailed out, or insurance companies bailed out. And in the process of consolidation of the control of our banking system by a select few large banks. Now, the National Bank under Hamilton extended credit. It functioned as a bank that extended credit to promote manufacturing and infrastructure. And it worked with private banks. It didn't eliminate private banks. Therefore, it wasn't just some sort of communist central control. It actually worked with local banks. And another example of this, Franklin Roosevelt was unable to replace the Federal Reserve Bank, but what he did is he bypassed it with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and with the Export-Import Bank. And what these institutions did is they, again, extended credit for production in the war effort, but even before that, in infrastructure. And the Export-Import Bank, for instance, extended credit to U.S. companies like Caterpillar and others to develop the heavy equipment necessary to build the Pan American Highway from Alaska to Chile, and to build the Burma Highway from Burma into China during World War II to provide supplies for the Chinese fighting the Japanese militarists. So that's one way to actually do this. And what one way to deal with this would be to transform the Federal Reserve into a national bank along the lines of what Alexander Hamilton did, where instead of bailing out bankrupt banks, it is being controlled by a private cartel of banks. It actually extends credit to the real economy. So this would be, in addition to the revenue that you derive from tariffs, you're actually extending credit, low interest credit. And you would do it through participatory loans to private banks. The private bank would get a credit from a national bank, and they would be the ones who would judge whether a project is creditworthy or not. and they would have to put up some of their funds along with the federal funds in order to fund a productive investment. Now, the advantage of this is that, one, you're increasing employment, productive employment. Secondly, you're increasing the tax revenue base without increasing taxes. And this, along with tariffs, could actually reduce the national debt. This is what Alexander Hamilton did. He eliminated the war debt from the Revolutionary War through a policy of productive investment from the National Bank. That's the kind of thing that we need to do today. And it's not enough to merely audit the Federal Reserve or to end it. You need to replace it with a national banking system, which is under the sovereign control of the U.S. elected government. Anything else is giving away our sovereignty.
Right. Which means it's under the control of the people.
Yes.
It's under the control of the elected.
Yes.
Right. And that's what we want. Right now, the way we have it is it's just an entity all to itself owned by private investors. And I think we just saw a good example last week where I forget who's in charge of the Federal Reserve right now.
Jerome Powell.
Yeah, did you see him? He said even if Trump asked him to resign, he wouldn't.
Right.
I mean, that's how independent these guys are. We can't have that. They're pulling the purse strings on our entire nation and the world.
But back in 1999, I believe it was, Tony Blair went to Chicago and gave a speech, and there were two critical aspects of what he defined as the New World Order. One was to limit sovereignty. And this has been a project of the British throughout the ages. H.G. Wells promoted this. Bertrand Russell. Their whole idea is to eliminate the sovereign nation state. This is what the actual source of a unipolar world is. It's to eliminate national sovereignty. The second part of what Tony Blair advocated was that we will have a system of independent central banks, because that also eliminates sovereignty. It's crucial to eliminating sovereignty to have independent central banks. And the kind of what we need in the world is what we need here. That is a national banking system where each nation has sovereign control over its economy. The European Union is an association forced upon Europe as a precondition for the reunification of Germany when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell. It was forced through by Thatcher and by Mitterrand of France. And the basic idea was you have to give up your sovereignty. So now no nation of Europe has any control over its own financial policy. None whatsoever. They are not sovereign nations. And that's what the British intend for the entire world. That's the actual nature of the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. It's a unipolar world, and they want to destroy us as much as they want to destroy Russia or China or India.
Right. Now, I think that gives us a good picture of, the national bank, and any one of these topics we're going over is material for an entire 2-hour interview. But I think you're giving us some good bullet points on each one. But when you just mentioned those 4 countries, now that's a kind of a good segue into the 4 powers, which is another thing that they are trying to break up. That's why we keep finding there's all these at war with each other, or cold wars, at least, with each other. And right now they're really pushing to get us into a hot war with Russia. Can you go into what the 4 powers is a little bit, and how, what the British are doing to break us up and keep us apart?
This is precisely
what I address in my book, Beware the British East India Company. The second aspect of the title is towards an alliance between the United States of America, Russia, China, and India to finally defeat the British Empire. And the point I make is that in 3 points throughout history, all 4 of these nations were in de facto alliance against the British Empire. At the time of the American Revolution, Russia, under Catherine the Great, initiated the League of Armed Neutrality against the British and in support of the American colonies. At that same time, the Indians were fighting the British Empire, as were the Chinese fighting the flow of drugs into their nation coming from the British. So all 4 nations were actually working together at that moment. And of course, the Boston Tea Party was aimed at the British East India Company. It was aimed to stop the British had imposed a tea tax, and so the American patriots mobilized the Boston Tea Party against the British East India Company. Second period of these 4 nations working together was the American Civil War. Again, the Tsar of Russia deployed the Russian fleet to the New York City and San Francisco harbor, and said that if it came to war with the British, that he would put them under the command of Lincoln, because they were sent there to prevent the British from intervening in defense of the Confederacy against the Union. Mm-hmm. And of course, at this same period of time, there was a mutiny in India of the Indian troops who were under the employ of the British Empire against the British East India Company. And as I said, there were 2 opium wars against China. So again, in terms of the global picture, these 4 countries were arrayed against the British Empire. Similarly, in World War II, in the fight against the Nazis and against Japanese militarists. Although the British would not allow India to operate in its own name, under its own government, in the alliance to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese, because Winston Churchill refused to allow the principle of self-determination to apply to India. So today, the basic idea is the British continue to try to divide and conquer these 4 nations, which historically have been allied with each other against the British. And after World War II, Roosevelt was very clear. He said that that the young people wouldn't be dying in the Pacific. He told this to his son Elliot, with whom I met a couple times back in the 1970s. He told Elliot, Roosevelt, the young people wouldn't be dying in the Pacific today if it weren't for the greed of the British, the Dutch, and in particular, and the French imperialists. And he said that after World War II, he would do everything in his power to prevent an alliance between the United States and England against Russia, and he would fight against giving any aid to French, Dutch, or British imperialism in the post-World War II period. But after his death, that was reversed. And of course, we ended up going into Vietnam after the French had returned there, and the Queen of Netherlands had agreed with Roosevelt to give up its colonial control over Indonesia, but she reversed that also when Roosevelt died. And you had similar situations. Today, what we're seeing in terms of the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, which is an extension of earlier wars in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, this is the British policy, which is a great game. That's what they call it, a great game, to essentially encircle Russia in particular, and prevent and to drive a wedge between the United States, Russia, China, and less so India. But the point is, what my book proposes is based upon a proposal by Lyndon LaRue, that these 4 powers, they're different. They have different systems, but these 4 powers have the power
if they work together to create a new Bretton Woods system, they have the power to finally defeat the British Empire. And that's and you have to create a new Bretton Woods system, which is not based on green ideology and the policies of Thomas Malthus. It's not based upon free trade. It's based upon respect for sovereignty and a commitment to national banking as opposed to central banking, commitment to raising the standard of living of all of the people throughout the world through high capital-intensive goods, nuclear fusion, not windmills and solar panels, not biomass. These cannot support industrialization. They just can't. So you need you have to be on the frontiers of science. We need to be going into space, which I think President Trump is going to do. We need to go back to Mars. We have to go back to the moon. We have to mine helium-3, which is a source of fusion power on the mine, and we have to go to Mars. And I agree with Elon Musk on what he said in this respect. It's very similar to what the great German space scientist who worked with the United States, Kraft-Erika, said. Man has an extraterrestrial imperative. It's our imperative to help develop first the solar system, the galaxy, but eventually the universe as a whole. That's our mission.
I think if you look at the evidence, it is. I mean, we just naturally want to do this, just like we naturally want to expand and create, right? And that's something the British system seems to be dead against. So I think that kind of encapsulated that. Now, and maybe we can do another talk on the four powers. You know, I mean, that you could do a whole hour easily on that.
Yep.
And also people should read your book, I believe. But can we kind of put all this together in what's going on in the world today? I mean, we've got some good examples. I mean, like right now, you can see the British, well, people don't know it's coming from the British. This is what I want to link. But what we see is the powers are being kept apart. For example, we've got Trump, one of his main missions is to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, and which is really us, you know, it's a proxy war, right? And now he's coming in the office. He's already starting to talk to these guys. And then Biden, I'm sure under the direction of whoever, right? Somebody in the oligarch, the British system, and maybe we can get more specific about that, but orders missiles to go from the launching of missiles from Ukraine into Russia now, just like that, while we're working toward getting Trump in office, while he's working on uniting everybody, right? It's so obvious that it's purely intentional, and somebody's trying to just botch things up, right? So, and that's just an example. Can you go into like, what kind of evidence do we have that it's the British doing this kind of thing? If not just that, but specifically that kind of thing. Behind the wars, you name it.
After Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, his son Randolph Churchill told Walter Lippmann, "You don't understand the British Empire. We dragged you into the First World War, we dragged you into the Second World War, and we're going to drag you into a third." That's literally a quote. And that is the policy of the British. What people don't understand is that the United States has functioned as a dumb giant on a British league. The British don't have to be militarily stronger than the United States. If they can deploy the United States' military power for their purposes. And this is precisely what they do. In other words, it's a mental control. If you can control, for instance, the U.S. poet Edgar Allan Poe, in a short story called Malanta Torta, said that an oligarchy can control a population if they convince them that there are only two pathways to truth: empiricism, sense perception, and on the other hand, logical deduction.
Okay.
But that's not the nature of man. Man is characterized by creativity, by the capacity to generate higher order hypotheses, invention. And so the British, what they do is they try to destroy creativity. They try to create a mental control through empiricism and logical deduction. So when everybody, and it's not just in the United States, throughout the world, people say the problem is the collective West, led by the United States. That's not the case. The United States is manipulated by the British, whose policies are being carried out. The Paris Climate Treaty, that's strict Malthusianism. So the British East India Company still exists. Thomas Malthus' policies are hegemonic in the world. Every nation of the BRICS, with the exception of Iran, belongs to the Paris Climate Treaty. It's only President Trump who withdrew from it and has now promised to withdraw from it again, who recognizes that anthropogenic climate change is a scientific fraud. Okay, so that is climate change created by human industrial activity. So the point here is that the British are behind the entire operation in Ukraine. They have, and in terms of the Middle East, they worked through Obama and the overthrow of Gaddafi. What's happened to Libya since? It's non-functional. It was Tony Blair who wrote. He's the one who put forward what was called the I guess it's called the Dodgy or dossier on weapons of mass destruction, which was then filtered into the United States, and we had Colin Powell making his UN speech about weapons of mass destruction. But Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11.
No.
So those wars were waged. In that case, the British. There was a weapons inspector in David Kelly in Britain. They said he committed suicide because he was opposing Tony Blair on this lie about weapons of mass destruction. But there was never really a thorough investigation of what happened to him. So this is what the British do, and that's what they're doing now with it was Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, who goes to Kiev and convinces them not to go ahead with the treaty which the Ukrainians had already initialed to settle the Ukraine war in 2022, 2 years ago. And right now, if you look at it, who's Secretary General of NATO? It's the former Prime Minister of Netherlands, Rutte. And you've got the current leadership of the British government. They're all in the forefront of pushing no compromise with Russia. We have to strategically defeat Russia. Why do they do that? Because they want to have a division between the United States and Russia. That's primarily what it is. They know that their whole system depends upon that. And you can look at some of these. I mean, you can look at the whole Russia hoax operation. That was MI6. It was Christopher. Right. He just wrote a new book, Unredacted, and tried to intervene in the U.S. elections to defeat Trump once again as a threat to democracy. He's MI6. Yes, so former agent, but he's MI6. And this is the reality of what we see. The Five Eyes. This is created which is New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, and England, created after Roosevelt's death. These are the intelligence the way the British control the way U.S. intelligence operates through that Five Eyes agreement. And So you just look at the overall pattern. People are convinced that it's the U.S. which is has seceded, is a successor to Great Britain as a new empire, but that's not the way it works. The majority of the U.S. population just voted for President Trump, who doesn't want war, wants to end war, wants to have protected territories, does not want to have an empire. So that's not what America is historically, or what even the currently elected president is for. So it's their control over what people sort of popularly call the deep state in the United States. But it's not limited to a deep state in the United States, so therefore it's something broader. It controls other nations in the world. And many of the further point is that even nations such as Russia, China, and India are operating to at least some extent under the mental shackles of the British Empire because it's dominant. That's why they go along with green ideology. Why would they do that? This is the policy of Thomas Malthus. So why do they advocate free trade in the World Trade Organization? That's Adam Smith. Why do they do that? So because the British keep it, they've convinced people that it's the United States that's the problem, and hide the fact that they're the ones behind the scene manipulating the situation. It's like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain.
Right. And so what it amounts to is, first of all, some of this stuff is visible right in the here and now, right? Like Tony Blair doing what he did to on the weapons of mass destruction. He was the one behind that, right? And if you look at this, who's behind what? All these different periods, and the British Prime Minister a couple of years ago, Boris Johnson, keeping Zelensky and Putin apart from completing that treaty, and so on. If you pay attention to that, and then you really kind of need to study Malthus and even Keynes to really be able to see what's going on without even being told point blank, to make it so when you see the news, you know what's going on. When you see Paris Accord, you know what's behind that, right? But on that note, and I realize it might not be that visible yet, but have you seen, like, for example, we saw it was real overt that Boris Johnson flew over to Ukraine and broke up the meeting between Putin and Zelensky. But now, with us launching missiles, or us on the behalf of Ukraine launching missiles into Russia now, have you seen is there anything visible about the British having anything to do with that? Because I know they are. I know that's who's behind it.
Well, one of the systems is a British system, and while President Biden was resistant to that, to giving the okay to attack with use these missiles within Russia, he succumbed to it. But that was under massive pressure coming from the British, who wanted this to be done. And I would also point out that although Cy Hirsch says that the United States was responsible for blowing up the gas pipelines, early on the Russians, when the bridge in Crimea was attacked, had said that it was a special British naval operations group that was providing training to Ukrainians to take out the bridge in Crimea, and that this was the same unit
that they suspected was involved in the blowing up of the Gazprom pipelines. So that doesn't mean that there isn't collaboration between certain elements in the CIA and British intelligence and so forth. But these actions are really in the interests of the British, and you can't just. Hertz may be right, but on the other hand, I think that the Russian initial response may actually be more correct than what Hertz has said. So,
What was their initial response?
the response was that there was a British naval operations unit that was providing the training and directing the attack on the Crimea Bridge, and that this same unit was providing Ukrainians assistance in the they believed in the bombing of the pipelines. So of course we don't know for certain because there a thorough investigation has been blocked.
Okay, yeah, I wonder why.
We don't know for certain. We can't say for certain. But what I'm saying is that one shouldn't rule out that the British were involved in that. The British were very clearly involved in pushing for the deployment of these long-range missiles into Russian territory. And I believe that recently, when that occurred, at least some spokesmen in Russia referred to the fact that Russia regards Britain as their traditional enemy for good reason.
They're pretty
Great game policy. This great game policy of the British goes back to the early 1800s. They were terrified that the Russians would invade India through Afghanistan or through Iran and throw them out of India, which was the crown jewel of their empire. So they developed what became the Great Game, or later under Brzezinski was the Ark of Crisis, to base on to Mackinder, the geopolitician, the British geopolitician. He developed a whole theory about how you you surround the heartland, which is Russia, Eurasia, with the rim countries, and prevent the Eurasian nations from dominating the world. This is a long-standing British geopolitical policy, and for instance, it was the British who waged wars in the first I think it was 2 wars in Afghanistan in the 1800s. For this reason, they wanted to surround Russia. So when you look at something like Ukraine, and the fact that the NATO moved eastward, contrary to promises that it wouldn't, it has to be seen as part of the British geopolitical great game. It's not something that was just developed recently by the United States as an emerging empire replacing Britain, but it's a continuation of the British geopolitical strategy, and it's something which the British are pursuing to this day.
Right. So yeah, and even if America were the ones that directly blew up that pipeline, let's say, that doesn't mean the British weren't behind it somehow, right? I mean, they use our CIA and so on, and they use, I'm sure they use the equivalent of our CIA in, like, let's say China, to do things against the U.S. And it keeps the war going, keeps us all at odds with each other. Now, of course, one has to research that stuff to really prove it's true or not, but there's enough evidence to show, at least warrant further investigation on all this. And in the meantime, let's operate. To me, it's perfectly sane to operate on that theory, because when you
like in a scientific theory, you might not know for sure the outcome, but you operate on the theory until it doesn't work anymore, right? So if you operate, every time this country has operated on the American system, things went much better. And then when we shrink back and operate under the British system, things get worse. And you can almost see it visibly in Trump versus the Biden administration, right? I mean, right there. And I don't know that either one of them, absolutely were well, I'm using the American system and I'm using the British system. I don't know that it was that clear to either one of them, but Trump knew what the hell he was doing and what works, and it happens to match very closely with the American system. And Biden was the opposite. So
let me just say, President Trump is unique in that he has actually advocated the American system and what he calls the American model. He did this in 2017 in 3 speeches, one in Willow Run, Michigan, another in Kentucky, and then one in Washington, D.C., where he talked about the American system explicitly. But let me also just bring up a couple other examples in terms of how the British operate. Bertrand Russell was a so-called British philosopher and peacenik. But of course, after World War II, he advocated a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia if Russia didn't agree to a U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons. And as it turns out, the British, after Roosevelt's death, had a plan called Operation Unthinkable, in which they wanted to launch a war against Russia, right after we had defeated the Nazis as allies. Fortunately, that didn't go forward. Let's look at the green ideology. Besides Malthus, the whole green ideology, in a certain sense, gained an impetus after World War II through the creation of the World Wildlife Fund by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who the royal Dutch family has recently admitted was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party back in the 1930s, and Prince Philip of Great Britain. One of the leading advocates of the Paris Climate Change Treaty is a German by the name of Joachim Schellenhuber. He was made an honorary commander of the British Empire after he for his work in advocating green ideology. And at one point, he said that the carrying capacity of the planet Earth for human beings is only 1 billion. And so then you have to ask, what about the other 6 or 7 billion people on the planet Earth? That's a genocide way beyond anything that's ever happened previously. But that's why he got his award as honorary commander of the British Empire. So the point is, the British Empire and the ideas of the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, are alive today, and they have to be defeated if the world is going to survive, and that includes the current threat of thermonuclear warfare. And President Trump is correct in saying that this, rather than climate change, which is a fraud, is the major threat to the human species.
A real obvious one.
And it comes from the British. Hey, so again, in terms of Bertrand Russell, I think I neglected to complete that. What he said the only way to avoid war between the United States and China was for the West to become socialist. And that's precisely what we've seen going on with the European Union and with the efforts, particularly of the Democratic Party, over the last couple decades, particularly under the current outgoing administration.
Right. The way to what was it? The way to defeat what was to become socialist?
Way to avoid war between China and the United States and the West as a whole was that the West had to become socialist.
What an easy solution. Why not? Let's do it.
And you mentioned Keynes. I didn't raise Keynes, but John Maynard Keynes is the economist of choice of the Democratic Party in the United States.
Right.
And people abroad also have illusions about John Maynard Keynes. For instance, the former chairman of the Bank of China in 2009 wrote a paper in which he said that Roosevelt was wrong about the original Bretton Woods and that John Maynard Keynes was much more foresight. Much more foresight. But the fact of the matter is, John Maynard Keynes he started out in the British India office. He eventually became he admitted that he was a follower of Thomas Malthus. He became a leader of the Malthusian Society in Great Britain, and also of the Eugenics Society in Great Britain. And unbelievably, people in the world give this person credence when he's actually advocated a policy which was completely criminal.
Right. Yeah, and Roosevelt booted him right out.
Right.
Yeah.
For
obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So, well, personally, I think you've done a great job here on relating things as well as one could in 1 hour. I would suggest people read your book to learn even more, and really, if it's the British behind all this sounds far-fetched. Really, all you have to do is look. You just gave a few pieces of evidence there. Boris Johnson, and guy who was a former prime minister. During the Iraq War.
Tony Blair.
Yeah, Tony Blair with the weapons of mass destruction. There's plenty more. Really, all you have to do is look, and then on top of that, do a little study and research, and it all makes sense because they aren't teaching this in school, and they're not talking about it on the news. So, in conclusion, is there anything else you'd like to say about this topic? Other than the fact I want people to know where to get your book and all that. So,
well, many people think that the BRICS are an alternative, but and I think that the advantage of the BRICS nations, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is now expanding, they're primarily a defensive association in the face of the sanctions, coercive political sanctions imposed against Russia and other nations. They defend national sovereignty, which is good, but unfortunately, they adhere to the Paris Climate Treaty. They want to strengthen the World Trade Organization. They want to impose a carbon tax, and they want better representation in the World Bank and the IMF, which are bankrupt institutions.
Right.
So what's unique about the four-power, the idea of an agreement between the four powers to create a new Bretton Woods, is that it seems completely counterintuitive. How can you get these four powers to work together? But with the crises that we're facing in the world today, including the danger, especially, of thermonuclear war, it's under these circumstances that you have to entertain a higher order hypothesis as to what the solution is. And remember, financial institutions and financial policies are the primary driver for the danger of war. And that's been the case throughout humanity. And so if you don't address that problem and correct it, you may come to some practical or pragmatic agreements to end particular conflicts in the short term. But do you have a durable solution that's going to last 50 years or 100 years? That's a big if. And a new Bretton Woods system, replacing the old one, with these four powers taking the initiating role not limited to those four powers, but they're the ones who have the power to initiate this, then you've got a chance for a durable solution to the world crisis that's going to last even before, for instance, this upcoming 4-year term of President Trump. And unless you do something like that, what agreements are going to be durable? What agreements are going to be are not going to be thrown out by some succeeding administration, not only of our country, but of other countries. So you need to come to a principled agreement now that goes beyond merely pragmatically solving some of the problems that we're faced with in the world. And the book includes in chapter 12 a proposed agreement, which is based upon a letter that I wrote when I was president of the Schiller Institute back in 2018 to President Trump, President Putin, President Xi, and Prime Minister Modi for such an agreement. And I think the time for such an agreement has come.
I do too. And I think, and that agreement is, in case a lot of our audience hasn't heard of it, it is out there. It's been around for years. Lyndon LaRoche started putting that forward, 30 years ago, maybe? 20?
Well, at least, in the early 2000s is when he began to put that forward. So it's there.
It's there. It's been there, and there have been people in higher offices listening to it too. It hasn't become totally accepted yet, or known, but it needs to be. And people like Trump who is educated in that, and a lot of that from Lyndon LaRoche. He's getting a good beginning to it, I'd say. And he's the kind of guy to do it. You know, the way he's good at communication and putting people together instead of apart, So I think that's one thing we've got to work on over the next 4 years, because Trump's going to put out some fires, and then he wants to create and make things better, but this kind of thing's going to cement things in and make things last a long time. And that's what we need to do, get people educated while things are getting improved. And we can actually do it without thinking a rocket's going to come into our living room any minute.
Yeah.
So, on that note, anything else before we go?
No, I'd just like to thank you very much for having me on so we could have this discussion, and I hope it leads some of your listeners to want to pursue the idea further.
Well, thank you. And I know for a fact they can get your book on Amazon, paperback and audio, as I listened to it twice, by the way. Any other versions of the book or any other ways of getting it?
Well, there's an electronic Kindle version available on Amazon as well.
Those are good too, because you can, if you want, listen to those.
Audio.
Pardon?
Paperback, electronic Kindle, and also the audio. All available on Amazon.
Right. So any one of those three methods, very inexpensive and very helpful. So thank you, Will, very, very much. I hope my audience is more educated now, and we look forward to more conversations.
Very good. I'd enjoy that.
A great, Will. I look forward to it. You have a good, happy holiday.
You too. And all of your listeners.
Thank you all for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast, as others may very much need this information. And for even more information on the topics we just covered, you can get Will's book, Beware the British East India Company, available in audio, Kindle, and print versions on Amazon. And there are tons of footnotes and links in this book, so you can verify the information it contains. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, my contact info is on my website at takecontrolofyourliberty.com. so please feel free to contact me. And until next time, remember to take control of your liberty, because you don't want anyone doing that but you.